Hello, and welcome to Dynamic Range Day 2020. I hope, if you can see me, if the bandwidth is working, the whole situation with the virus and the internet has been tricky this week, but hopefully things are working for you. If they are, please drop a comment into the comments box so that I can see and know that you can see and hear me. Hi, Bob. Sebastian, hi. Great, loads of people we know. So thanks for being here. As I said on my webcast a few days ago, I almost postponed or even cancelled the event this year. I was concerned that, with the current situation, people wouldn't have the bandwidth or would kind of feel that it was maybe inappropriate to be talking about something as relatively trivial as loudness and dynamics at a time like this. But, I asked the audience, and the response was overwhelmingly that we should go ahead, that we should do this day anyway. We should not let the current difficult situation stop us. So here we are. If you're new to the event, just quickly, Dynamic Range Day is an online event aimed at raising awareness of the loudness war, this trend over the years for the levels on CDs and in digital files to be pushed up and up and up. The reason for that is to try and make you stand out from the competition, to compete, or to hopefully sell more records. And unfortunately, none of those things stand up in the research. Loudness, people just don't care about loudness in that way. These days when people listen online, the chances are they'll never hear it at the original loudness that it was mastered at anyway. And even if they listen on a CD where they will hear the full loudness, everybody has a comfortable listening level. They adjust the volume, and then your CD, anyone's CD, will sound the same loudness as everybody else's, as is appropriate for the genre. So I can see the comments ticking up here. I'm going to pause and say hello to a few more people. Hi, Darren. Hi, Ken. In fact, drop some comments and tell us where you're from. Arkine von Drekkenov. Now, that's a name. Fantastic. Marco says hi from Denmark. Excellent. Glad to see you're all there. Okay, so what's going to happen? The plan, so there's this webcast now. In a few minutes, I'm going to be bringing Mike Hillier from Metropolis Mastering here in the UK onto the stream with me, and we're just going to have a conversation about his experiences with loudness and the state of play, if you like. So this is 2020. The first Dynamic Range Day was in 2010. And I just thought that seemed like that's actually 11 years because of the way anniversaries work, but it seemed like a suitable moment to pause and reflect and maybe try and figure out where we're at after those 10 or 11 years. Have things changed? Are they better? Are they worse? And talk to as many people as I can about how it's affecting them. So I'll be talking to Mike in a minute. Then I have another webcast planned for 3 p.m. UK time, where I'm hopefully going to have a few other friends from other audio websites and podcasts and blogs joining me on the stream just for an informal discussion about all this kind of stuff. And maybe we can invite a few of you guys into the stream and answer some questions depending on how things go. 3 p.m. has been tough in terms of the bandwidth here and the quality of my stream, but if needs be, I will stream from my phone. We will make it happen one way or another. And then finally, tonight at 10:30 p.m. UK time, GMT, will be the traditional Dynamic Range Day webcast where I have, all being well, Ailco Grimm and Bob Katz will be joining me, and we're all going to talk. And maybe, I don't want to announce yet in case he can't make it, but I have another guest who I hope is going to make it. There's another name that you will all recognize. So we will be talking about all of these issues surrounding Dynamic Range Day from each of our different perspectives. Elko, you probably know, has been involved with with Tidal, doing research for Tidal on how their loudness normalization works. Their loudness normalization is slightly different than anybody else's. I think it's better. I want to find out from him how it's been received. Bob is a powerhouse of, he's just constantly working in the AES everywhere, on the issues of loudness. I'm sure most of you, he was talking about this stuff before I was a mastering engineer. He's still talking about it now. It'll be a pleasure to get the chance to talk to him about all of this as well. So that's the plan. I will also, throughout the day, hopefully be sharing some of the content from the Dynamic Range Day website. And that's what I'd like you to do, please. Please like and share this webcast and the other webcasts later in the day. Spread them as far and wide amongst your audience as you can to raise people's awareness. But also head over to dynamicrangeday.com. Look for the memes, look for the resources, share those. If you have music of your own that you've tried to make more dynamic, it'd be fantastic if you could share that with your audience and explain why you think it's important. If you've written any blog posts or talked about it on a podcast of your own, or maybe you have a YouTube channel, whatever it is, anything you can do to help people discover this issue and realize it's important. And the message is that this is an opportunity. Nobody's saying don't make your music incredibly loud if that's your passion, if that's your vision for it, if that's part of the sound. Music is a creative industry. You're allowed to do whatever you like, but don't feel that you have to. Don't feel pressured into it by the need to compete or any of those factors. Seize the opportunity to just ease back on the limiting, ease back on the compression a little bit, give your music more room, more life, and hopefully it will sound better as well. That's certainly my experience. So let's take a quick other look at the comments and just make sure that nobody says you look like a block of pixels from nowhere. That's interesting. Marco says he thinks the overall loudness in heavy metal has improved a bit. It's not much, but in the right direction. It's interesting. I agree with that. I do think that metal is... Hi, Davey from Australia. Ed, endorse it. Hi, Felix. Hi, all. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of ironic because metal is one of the most loud and aggressive genres, but I do think that's one where things have improved, which is great to see. And hopefully we'll see that kind of broaden out into other genres as well. So let's see whether this works. Mike, are you there? Can you hear me?
I am. Hello, Ian.
Fantastic. It works. Now, so Mike works at Metropolis Mastering in the UK. There's 2 or 3 really heavyweight mastering facilities in the UK. Metropolis is one of them. You can see behind him, beautiful. What are those? ATC?
They're PMC.
PMC. My bad.
These are MB1s. This room is set up for surround sound, so you can see the center and the left speaker at the moment.
Excellent. And if you just scooch to one side, we can see there's a really nice mastering console behind you, stacked full of lovely gear. I'm not jealous at all. I wouldn't want that in my home studio. It would just clutter the place up,
Gets away, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Mike, how are you? How are you coping with the current situation?
I'm coping quite well at the moment, I think. I mean, I'm fortunate. I live within cycle distance of Metropolis, so I can come into work every day without getting in public transport. Metropolis has been really good. No one's coming into work that has to use public transport. So if you can drive in, you can cycle in, you can come in. If you're otherwise, you're at home.
And you're locked away in your little mastering caves, beavering away.
Yeah, I've got a fairly thick door and some really thick walls, and my own independent air conditioning unit, which only services this room. So, yeah,
probably one of the safest places to be honest.
Well, could be, yeah.
Excellent. Well, okay, so I need to look at my question, remind myself what I was going to ask you. Yeah, I mean, maybe if we could start off just by talking about whether loudness is an issue for you at all, because I talk to some mastering engineers and they're kind of like, I just do what I do. Everybody's happy. There's no big deal. Is it something that you think about a lot, talk about a lot with your clients?
It can be, certainly. It's different with every single client, and I'm sure you've experienced this. Some clients, their opening email might include a link to one of your websites or one of your articles, and it might say, it might. We want it to sound dynamic, and we want it to work on Spotify and all this kind of stuff. And that's great because you know exactly what you're dealing with. You know exactly what they want from the master, and you can work to that goal. And then sometimes you get people who just want it as loud as possible, and that's your job sometimes. So it does definitely depend on who the client is.
And if somebody comes in and they want it as loud as possible, and you really feel that it's not best serving the music, do you try and prompt them on that? Do you try and ask questions, or do you just? I mean, I guess again, it depends on the individual client. But if you sense that maybe there's some room for a conversation.
Yeah, if there's room for a conversation, if you can, most of the time I will just do what's right for the track anyway. So if the reference material I think is wrong for the song, I'll just do what I think's right for the song and kind of ignore the reference material a little bit. And it's never really been a problem. No one's ever really gone, oh, you've completely ignored, whatever I sent through. There have been occasions though when I've sent something back and it's been, it's come back and it's gone, I like it, but can you make it louder? And then you'll open up a dialogue and I'll be, and I'll try and explain why I think my version is superior, but I will also make that louder version for them there and then without question, send that through to them and go, from here on, it's up to you. I've explained why what I did the first time round is what I liked. There's what you've asked for, because I don't want to be difficult. I don't want to be that guy who refuses to do requests for clients. So I'll hand that over, and if the client wants to use the louder one, then it's the client's decision. It's their song and they've got to live with it. I don't actually have to listen to it ever again.
That's a fair point. What kind of success rate would you success rate? Yeah, it's a success rate because you've done what you thought was right musically, what best suited the material, and then they're asking you to do something different, and that kind of maybe conflicts a little bit with your opinion. So is it 50-50? Do you think most of the time? Because something interesting I've noticed is that often people come to it and they think they want it super loud, and I will say to them, that's not really, that doesn't excite me. I think really, if you want it really loud, you maybe should work with somebody else. And quite often they'll say, well, show us what you would do. So I do exactly what I normally do, not super loud, but definitely up there in the sweet spot. And they go, yeah, that's great. That's exactly what we thought. That's exactly what we had in mind. So what they thought they wanted, what they were asking for, and what they actually liked and were happy with turned out to be different. Have you found that?
Certainly sometimes. I'd say most of the time, the client, if they've got something in their mind that they want, that is really what they want. And it's my job, we're a service industry. It's our job to provide to the client whatever it is that they want, whatever's in their head. And if that involves brick walling something to death, then so be it. It doesn't happen that often. That, I'd say well over 90% of my clients are just happy with what you send them the first time. And revisions, you can almost spot them before you've done the job. You can be like, this job's coming back. And it's certain jobs, they're just really easy because the mix is really good. Everything about it's really good. The communication's been really good. And so, the minute you send it back to them, they're going to be happy and they're never going to come back. And you're going to get a nice, hopefully a nice polite email saying, loved it. Thank you very much. And then other jobs, you just sense it. You get that deep sense of like, this isn't very good. And I'm going to have to do a lot of work on it and say, start reaching for tools that I wouldn't normally reach for, multi-band stuff and loads of mid-side and all that kind of stuff. And you pulling it back and you're like, right, I've made this. I've made this something. It's a track now. And inevitably it'll come back and it'll be like, I really like what you've done, but can you have it louder? Yeah. You know what? I've worked a lot on this and I'm not sure how much more time I can push at you. But you give it, you do that. You give them the louder version. You give them that. You give them whatever they want because that's your job.
I mean, that's interesting because I have a different take, which is that I genuinely don't. Not because of some kind of philosophical thing, but just because I don't enjoy. I mean, it's different for me because obviously I don't know. You work for Metropolis. I assume a certain number of your clients come through the facility, and so somebody else has agreed that the job is going to be done by, and you're the person who does that job. Whereas for me, everything is a direct communication with the client. So I kind of have more flexibility, and I'm lucky that, well, I don't get that many requests for super loud stuff, but also I can just politely say, I'm really sorry, I just don't enjoy, I'm not the best person for this. I think and I can suggest somebody else who I know, is going to be more comfortable with what they want. I think both of those approaches are valuable. I mean, because I find the whole, this is a service industry thing. I mean, absolutely, of course it is. It's their music. You want them to be happy. And I think maybe that's why I don't go for those jobs, because I'm not convinced I'm going to be able to make them completely happy, because I'm not completely happy. For me, mastering really goes well when I'm just loving what I'm doing and how it's working with the music. But part of our service is to offer the best information we can to our clients. So again, I guess in the end, it just comes down to, yes, you offer that information. If they choose something different, then you go with it.
Exactly.
And that's what I would do if in the same situation. Notice if I was working for a record label and you've done 10 albums a particular way, and then you don't want to mess up that relationship for the sake of one project where their opinion is different to ours. So I was interested to talk about mixes, though, because as you say, sometimes you get great mixes, sometimes you get terrible mixes. One thing that lots of mastering engineers are saying to me is that they feel a little bit hard done by, that a lot of the blame for the loudness issue is being put onto them, because actually the mixes that come into them are already super loud. Somebody emailed me 2 days ago saying, they got sent these mixes and half of them were at -6 LUFS integrated, that's louder than I've ever mastered anything. And that was just the mix. Are you finding that, or is that okay?
Yeah, that happens all the time. It's completely believable that something will come in and it'll be way louder than I'll want it. And sometimes, depending on what if it's a single, maybe you just kind of do what you can to it, send it back. Sometimes we reject things. We just straight up say, can we have another mix? And I'm quite open about providing feedback with clients before, if I think the mix isn't ready, I'll write to the client and I'll happily kind of suggest things that they can do to make the mix a bit better. It's not always a possibility. There's, a lot of my clients are overseas, and there's language barriers between what I'm able to suggest and things. But I also, as I say, a lot of my clients will come to me specifically because, they know they can send me the track a few days before they send it to Metropolis for mastering. They can say, here's my mix at the moment. What needs to happen? So that's a really nice thing. But equally, you do get tracks in from mixers, some big names, some small names, where it's just already absolutely smashed, and going back for a revision on the mix isn't an option always. So sometimes you just got to work with that.
Yeah, well, I think the big names thing is an interesting one, because I've certainly heard several big name mixers complaining that they feel their stuff got wrecked at the mastering process, when they haven't been the people, if they've delivered to the client and then the client has taken it to be mastered and something has happened. Often they think that that's because of the need for loudness. So they've got into the habit of mixing so the stuff is already loud enough so that they've been in control of that process, so that they're happy with what then goes to the mastering engineer. And I guess, there's a certain logic in that. The disadvantage is it gives us less room to maneuver. A lot of the decisions that we would normally make have already been made for us. And if we disagree, well, there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, very, very much so. And one of the things you pointed out earlier is, I have this lovely analog equipment. It doesn't sound great if you hit it with something that's already at -6. It just doesn't. So a lot of the time with those jobs, they'll tend to stay in the box, and I'll put a Fab Filter EQ on it, or a Ozone something, and just do
maybe
that.
Maybe it's a new campaigning message I could put out, is like, if you supply your mix to me too loud, it's going to be done in the box. The louder it goes, the less you are to get that analog loveliness.
Yeah, and there have definitely been times where I've just simply turned it down and put it out through there anyway, just because I've known very specifically the tone of the Sontec EQ or something is going to give me exactly what I want much faster than I can try and emulate that with a plugin. But it's pretty rare.
So would you say the way things are, has it changed? You know, here we are, it's 10 or 11 years since the first dynamic range day. I would say, for me, I would say, people ask me this question a lot, and I feel it's become more polarized. There are people who have taken the whole message of dynamics on board and have moved away from what we had at the 1990 to 2000 and up to onwards. And then there are other people who are just kind of going for it even harder. I mean, or does it feel the same as it ever was to you? What's your perspective?
I think it's certainly changed in as much as, as I mentioned earlier, I'm getting feedback from clients which references yourself, your websites, your plugins. Obviously, that wasn't a thing 10 years ago. Those sites didn't exist. Those plugins didn't exist. The very fact that that is happening shows it's having an impact within certain groups of people, within certain musicians, certain engineers. That's absolutely what they want. And it's wonderful to work with those people because they're clearly engaged in that element of the process. There are clearly other parts of the process where it isn't a thing, and exactly what you're describing happens where the mix engineer has done all of the work for you and there's very little room to go and you just hand it back essentially. So yeah, it definitely has changed. There's definitely a progression towards slightly quieter things.
Do you think the thing I've noticed that has really made an impact, because obviously I've been talking about this for 10 years plus, but 10 years kind of in public loudly. And the thing that has really made a difference, I think, is this normalization online. So the fact that YouTube and Tidal and Spotify are turning loud things down, that's kind of, I guess it's cut through and caught the attention of people who otherwise might have just gone, loudness, whatever. Because either they want their stuff loud and it annoys them that it gets turned down, or they like their stuff dynamic and they're pleased that you have then the opportunity to master things with more dynamics. So I feel that that's a positive thing, and I'm optimistic about the future. I feel that over time, more people are going to experiment with more dynamic versions online, realize that it's still popular, it still sells, nobody complains, and things will move more and more in that direction. I always choose to be optimistic. That's my hope. There are other people who are kind of up in arms, feeling that normalization is a bit of a mess at the moment. It's complicated, it's confusing, it's inconsistent between the different services. Some of them work better than others. Some of them randomly don't. YouTube, you might just find something that hasn't been turned down, so it's way louder than everything else. And they're just kind of, we just need to get rid of all of this stuff. I mean, I generally don't think it's going away, because from the tech company's point of view, it's been very successful and it reduces the number of user complaints. I'm just curious, are you optimistic about it? Do you think that's been a good thing? Do you think it's a mixed bag? How do you see it?
Well, it's definitely a mixed bag, because there are definitely things that add to the complications. One thing is, there are 8 or so different targets. So what are we aiming for exactly? And another is the fact that, in my opinion, for a lot of music, minus 14 LUFS is probably too dynamic. And you get people who don't quite grasp that concept. So you're like, look, it's going to be turned down 2 dB, but it sounds great. So just let's leave it. Let's not open it up so that, it doesn't get turned down. Let's just let it get turned down. But that's another, additional complication when you've just won the battle on trying to convince them it doesn't need to be at -6 and you've got it to -11 or whatever, and it sounds great now. Now they want it at -14 because then it won't be turned down on Spotify. And so yeah, I think, and the other one is the potential for moving targets as well. We keep saying, we can make it so Spotify doesn't turn it down, but if Spotify change their algorithm next week, maybe it will get turned down. Maybe it'll get turned up. I don't know what they're going to do next week. So I tend to have a philosophy of not paying too much attention to exactly what LUFS it is, and just trying to make it sound good. That was what we got into this for, I think. And one of like kind of tricks I like to use quite a lot is on a lot of limiters, they'll, or even using your perception plugin, you can make it louder or quieter without being able to hear how loud or quiet it is. So on, for example, on Pro L2, which I use quite a lot, there's a mode which turns the output down as you turn the input up, so it always stays relatively the same. And that way you can just kind of hear the amount of limiting you actually want, because it adds to the thickness and the kind of drives everything together in a nice way. And you can hear when it's doing too much and it's starting to sound grotty, and you can hear when it's not doing enough. And so you can put the right amount without having to rely on numbers. You're just relying on your ears, which is, you know, they're always going to be the best tool.
They absolutely are. And it's something that I battle with, because, you know, I'm here doing things like this, campaigning on this issue, which is something that I feel passionate about. And I kind of follow the advice of, you know, look at the 20% of what you do is going to be 80% effective, and the other 80% is kind of not going to be effective. So the things that I have noticed being effective in getting this message across to people and getting to pay attention is pay attention to streaming loudness because of what's happening there, and giving people numbers as guidelines. The disadvantage of that for me is, I mean, boo-hoo, but you know, people perceive me as somebody who is all about the numbers and who's obsessed with the way that it sounds on streaming. The reality is I do exactly the same as you. I think, well, in fact, most mastering engineers, pretty much everybody I've talked to, if you leave a mastering engineer to master it the way they want to, for something pretty loud, it's going to be, you know, in that kind of -11, -12, maybe -14 range if it's more varied. They're going to balance the EQ. They're going to do all the things. You know, it sounds the same. Classic music, great sounding music, all the way through, to me, sounds very consistent. You know, if you go back to, you know, you look at something like Nevermind, or, you know, the Radiohead's stuff, or the Beatles, or Pink Floyd, or whoever it is, you know, Uptown Funk, Daft Punk, the Random Access Memories, all of these albums, they're not the same, but you know, they all fit together pretty well, and they were just mastered by the people doing it to sound great. And because the streaming companies have chosen their methods reasonably wisely, you know, that you can debate the details of it, but broadly, all that stuff sounds great online, even when it's turned down, as you say, by a couple of dBs. It's all the kind of the extreme stuff, that really quiet stuff and the really loud stuff, where problems start coming in. So yeah, I don't actually use my plugins like Loudness Penalty or Dynameter that much when I'm working. I just get on and master stuff, and then every so often I kind of glance at them and go, oh yeah, that looks about right. And it, you know, I know that if I master stuff using my normal working methods, and I'm sure you're the same, and I'm sure actually most mastering engineers are the same, they just know that it's going to work well out there in the world. So all of this kind of stuff, I see it's useful as part of the learning process, but that doesn't mean that it's the core of what we do, you know, or even why we do it. Like you say, it's all about making the music sound great.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, I don't like referring to meters and looking at things. I like to just think, oh, I'm enjoying this now. You know, I like to nod my head along to the music while I'm in the studio. Sometimes I like to dance. It'd be horrible if there was a camera in here all the time.
That's how I know where there's a moment where you're sitting there and you suddenly realize you're not concentrating on the numbers anymore. You're just kind of getting into it. And that's when you know that it's working, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're on the right track now.
Excellent. Well, those are all my questions. Thank you very much. I don't know how much time you've got, but I can see lots of comments cropping up in the stream here. I was just going to see if there's any. Have you got a few minutes to just chat? I don't want to keep you from your work. Let's have a look and see what we've got here. So Josh from Suffolk says, what do you guys recommend for mixing engineers to have on their master bus before sending it to you guys, meaning mastering engineers, to give the best result? So I'll go first. Nothing. That's not quite true. You know, there are two ways of working. You can mix into a bus compressor, in which case that's part of the sound of the mix, and you should leave it on. If, in my opinion, you've overcooked it, I might ask you to send me a version where it's pushed less hard or it doesn't have it, so I can compare and figure out how to get the best result. But generally speaking, if it's sounding great when you mix it with a bus compressor, that's the way that it should be. I prefer not to work with a bus compressor. It's just the way that I was kind of trained and what seems natural to me. But I do quite often put a global EQ on the stereo output, just to it's a kind of shortcut. You know, if I'm listening to it and going, oh, well, the kick needs more bass and the bass needs more bass and the low end of the guitars needs more, well, then a low shelf is a quicker way to achieve that on the stereo bus than going in on every channel. That's me. How about you, Mike?
I'm pretty similar. I would suggest, definitely, if you know what you're doing and you're putting the compressor on early in your mix, you're mixing into it, then it's giving you part of your sound. And if you pull it off, I find your mix kind of falls apart. A lot of your automation will be driven by the response of that compressor. You know, you kind of push into it and you pull away from it and you allow it to direct your movements in the mix. And so absolutely leave it on there. But if all you're doing is adding bus processing at the very end to kind of emulate mastering, as it were, I've probably got better compressors than you have. Not necessarily, but I've got some really nice ones, you know. And I've certainly got a room which is nearly perfectly tuned for listening and really nice PMC speakers. I'm going to pay attention to that. That's what you're paying me for. You know, you're paying for my attention to that. So if you do it for me and you're not doing as good a job, we're making the music worse. So leave it off.
Yep, I'd agree with that. Andrea Colombo says, so all else being equal, isn't more dynamic range better than less dynamic range? And in the worst case scenario, more dynamic range is kind of neutral. I actually disagree with that somewhat, Andrea. I would say that for me, it's all about the sweet spot. You know, Mike mentioned it earlier. We both kind of referred to it obliquely. You know, too loud is a problem because I find that you know there are compromises involved in pushing the loudness up, and eventually they start to impact on the way the music feels and the way we feel listening to the music and the way it's meant to work, and that's a problem. And that's what dynamic range day. That happens more often than anything else. So that's what dynamic range day is kind of here to raise awareness of and encourage people to experiment with moving away from. On the other hand, too quiet or too dynamic can also be a problem. If there's too much variety in the dynamics, it can be difficult to get stuff to translate on poorer quality systems, for example, or different listening environments. It also doesn't necessarily work musically. You know, the kind of the fine tune, that balance between the verse and the chorus, I find is pretty critical to a song's success. And often also the processing that we use to bring the loudness up is also beneficial. You know, you can use compression to just kind of, to glue the whole thing together, or to give it some density, or to give it some intensity. And those are all beneficial. So in that case, the more dynamic version would not sound as good, in my opinion, as the less dynamic version in any situation. Possibly if you had a fantastic system where you could just crank it up, it might. But for me, there's definitely a sweet spot. It needs to be loud enough, but not too loud. And most stuff is too loud, in my opinion, these days, which is why we need an event like this. But yeah, too dynamic can also be an issue as well. Would you agree with that, Mike?
Completely agree. Yeah, it's all about aiming for the sweet spot. It's all about trying to find the way that the music sounds best. And one of the things I find is things that are you can spot it straight away if someone hasn't used compression on their mix bus, I find. And these days it tends to be, you know, you mentioned yourself that you don't tend to use compression, but it tends to be people who don't know what they're doing most of the time. And that's absolutely fine. Your mix can still sound great without compression, but I will often listen to it and go, they've not used any compression on the mix bus. Everything sounds a bit disconnected. Let me grab a compressor and I'll make this kind of sound like a band should sound, like a record should sound.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, I think another reason I don't use it in the on the mix bus is that I actually started out as a mastering engineer. It's quite unusual. So I was trained in, I mean, I had been mixing stuff as a kid and as a student, but when I started work pretty much straight out of college, I went straight in to be trained as a mastering engineer. And then what I did was broadened out, and I had the opportunity to do some mixing and to do some recording. So I always had in my mind this understanding of what was going to happen at the mastering stage, and this understanding that providing, you know, I mean, there's compression used within the mix, but there was this opportunity to glue everything together even more at the final stage. So I'm not saying, you know, I mean, it's just two different ways of working. You know, there are big name mixers out there who absolutely slam the mix bus with compression, and then there are others who, you know, barely use it at all. So either way is fine. Yeah. We've got another comment here. Streaky says, "Get out of my room."
Sorry, Streaky, it's mine now.
Lots of people saying, if you want it loud, just turn it up. Say again.
I share this room with Felix Davis. I just however.
Yeah. And Claudia says, Crest Factor, the magic words. And yes, I would agree with that. So I'm sure everybody watching this, still watching this at this point, understands that Crest Factor is the difference between the peak loudness and the average loudness, or the short-term loudness. Excuse me, you can hear my family in the background, everybody at home. But yes, you can optimize the difference between the peak and the short-term loudness, which is, broadly speaking, the crest factor, and that's another way. And then it will work at pretty much any loudness that it gets played back at. Do you pay attention to the crest factor, Mike?
Not really. It's more numbers, isn't it, Ian? It's just numbers. I listen to it. If the crest factor is something I'm going to be able to hear when I'm working on, it's really weird, you've gone away. Crest factor is something I'm going to be able to hear when I'm listening to the master. If I think the crest factor is too high, I will squash it down. If I think it's too low, there's probably nothing I can do about it. But I don't look at the crest factor. I don't, you know, I might just think, oh, this is a bit peaky. So yeah, I'll deal with it that way.
That's fair enough. I mean, it's interesting because I developed a plugin, Dynameter, that enables people to look at the crest factor, or the PSR, the short-term peak to short-term loudness ratio, and I use it myself. I find it really helpful, just a way of kind of keeping an eye on what's going on. Really, I don't make decisions in the way that things should sound based on the way that it looks, you know, because we have to mix and master with our ears, obviously not our eyes. But I do think it's helpful, like using an analyzer, an EQ analyzer, or like using a VU meter or anything. I think all of these things are helpful when they're learning. I certainly remember when I was trained, you know, it was like, okay, there's the peak meter. It doesn't go above this. There's the VU meter. It wants to average this and go to there. There's the correlator, the phase meter, you know, all of these things. And you use them initially and they're helpful. And then eventually you get to the point where you probably don't need them anymore, but they're still there. So you still look at them. But I think that's the attribute of the music that we're kind of managing, if you like. And that's really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, look, crest factor is probably like one of the things we're changing the most, I'd say, in a lot of masters. Because EQ, you know, the odd half a dB here and a half a dB there isn't huge, but you might throw 4 dB of limiting on something. You're just going, no way.
I might throw four, but 4 would be at the upper range.
I'm like 10, 8.
But I'd happily throw 3, 4, 6 dBs of compression if necessary.
Right.
If something hadn't been through a mixed bus compressor.
A little bit different. Maybe if it hasn't been through a mixed bus compressor, maybe. I don't know. I don't like using too much compression. I probably prefer a bit more limiting sometimes. But we're getting into like personal preferences here. And the question is just like, we are changing either way, whether you do it with a compressor or limiter, you're changing the crest factor. And so it just is the thing we're dealing with constantly. And so am I paying attention to it? Yeah, of course I am. It's something that it's fundamental to what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So last question, I think a couple of people asking whether we have any particular records that we use as reference material. The answer for me is yes, but it's probably stuff nobody's ever heard, because I use stuff that I've mastered in the past, not necessarily because it sounds it sounds pretty good, but not necessarily because it sounds fabulous, but just because I know it intimately. How about you?
I have a whole bunch of stuff that I reference, and it will often depend on what the track is. So obviously, I still miss Jeff Buckley, as it says on my shirt, so I reference that a lot. But Billie Eilish is something we've been referencing a lot this year, or last year. Yeah, it changes a lot because it depends on what is fashionable right now. For a long time it was Daft Punk, for or the other one you mentioned earlier. I've forgotten the name.
Uptown Funk, Mark Ronson's.
Uptown. Yes, exactly, that one. So that was a a near constant thing of, we want to sound like this. So yeah, you'll do a lot of that. There's a lot of Tame Impala gets referenced a hell of a lot these days. But you can't have just your own take on what you're referencing to. The client has to kind of drive that a little bit, because you might think it wants to sound like Tame Impala and they want to sound like U2, and you're going in the wrong direction. And they're not that dissimilar bands, but they are different directions for kind of the same material. So yeah, I have several computers in this room, one of which has got Tidal on it, and so I have access to the entire Tidal library, the entire Spotify library, and then obviously YouTube. And if it's on Tidal, whatever the song is that the client wants me to listen to, I'll take a listen to it. I'll take a listen to their song. If they're reasonably similar, then I will record in off Tidal and have it in Sadie as a thing that I can constantly refer back to. If I just think maybe it's just more of a vibe thing that they're going for, and that they don't really want to sound exactly like that song, I'll probably just listen to it a couple more times and get a feel for it. But it's new songs with everything I'm working with.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's I'm the same. You sometimes clients will send in very specific references. Sometimes you get a list of references where you think, okay, but you've sent me a metal album and you've sent me Simon and Garfunkel. That genuinely happened. That's a real example. And other times you get no references at all. One thing I'll say is that quite often if people send me references, I will start off by ignoring them. I usually master it myself, doing just what I think. And then I take a listen to the reference and figure out whether that's going to, and I guess maybe that's slightly inefficient if they, usually I have an idea in my head of what the reference is going to sound like anyway, because I've probably heard it before. But in fact, I guess that's the majority. So I'm not working completely blind, because it's like, oh, okay, they're thinking that. So that's how I go into it. But anyway, the good thing about it is that quite often the success rate is really, really high. Just also, for anybody, go on.
I was going to say, they're hiring you because they want your take on it. So if all you do is listen to another record and make it sound exactly like that other record, and let's say that other record's been mastered by, I'm going to pick someone at random from this building, Stuart Hawkes, who is just across the corridor from me. Well, if they just want me to do it to sound like Stuart Hawkes, they should have hired Stuart Hawkes. He's on the same webpage. It's just a slightly different mouse click that you've got to move to get him, and then he'll do your record for you. So if you want me, I presume it's because you want me to do it, and you want what I like about your songs and what I don't like about your songs to impact how I work.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably a good place to leave it, because at the end of the day, mastering is all about, it's a conversation. The best mastering jobs are ones where we talk to the clients and we have a conversation about what's going to be best for the material, and everybody agrees. And the where you run into problems if somebody sends you something blind with no comments, you send it back, and then they just end up not using it because they didn't like it and they didn't even tell you. It's pretty rare for me, luckily, but I know that there are people doing that. For some reason, actually, I think people feel it with the major facilities. If they send it somewhere with a big name, and if it's an online system, they're almost reluctant to kind of speak their mind. And I know that you, and I'm sure the other engineers at Metropolis as well, would always prefer to get feedback from a client if they had any reservations or concerns, or even if they just loved it and wanted to tell you that.
Yeah, great. I love it. I love getting responses, whether it's positive or negative. it's not nice when they're rude, but it certainly happens. But if you've got an issue and I've added to your mix and you want less bass or you want more bass or whatever, more than happy to do it. It's usually 5 minutes or so to just quickly bring it back up, have the desk reset, and I'll be listening to your track again.
Well, and it's funny, isn't it, how often somebody sends you something and they're kind of there in agony because it's not, and it's going to, and you listen to it, you go, oh, okay, just needed an extra half dB there, and you send it back and they're like, oh, thank you, and you're kind of like, it's okay, fine, it was no big deal.
Of course, more than happy to do it.
Yeah, and it's amazing how those tiny little changes can affect everybody's perception. Anyway, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great talking to you. I hope everybody watching has enjoyed it. I've seen some comments on there saying that I turned into a single pixel at one point. If that's the case, then I apologize. Hopefully the quality was reasonable enough for everybody. Remember, we've got more events coming up, or webcasts coming up during the day. The next one is at 3 p.m., which is in 4 and a bit hours. Head over to the Facebook page or the YouTube channel I'll be adding that so you can like it, share it, spread the word even more. Please head over to the Dynamic Range Day website and share some of the content that you find there. If any of the memes amuse you, or you find any of the resources or anything on the site useful or interesting, and you think other people might as well, please use the hashtag Dynamic Range Day, all one word, so that everybody can see exactly how much influence we're happening. And thanks for listening. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Ian.
Cheers, everybody. We'll see you later on in the day.